out of these words. Thanks be to
Thanks
God.
be to God. This sermon today, I hope, is going to be fairly straightforward, but it is about a complicated issue that needs our full hearts, our full minds, and our full selves. I'm going to ask us, the people of Westmoreland Congregational United Church of Christ, to consider how we as a predominantly white congregation might offer financial reparations to Black Americans and or to historically Black institutions. First, let me say that I have been in conversation with some of my United Church of Christ colleagues here in the DC area and with our conference staff about this. Our hope is to convene a conversation of the leaders of predominantly white UCC congregations in the Potomac Association to talk about reparations and to have conversations with the leaders of the historically Black UCC congregations in the area to ask what they need from us as colleagues and as friends and as partners, and perhaps to develop with their leadership a potential plan for church-based reparations. Here is a possible plan: to ask predominantly white UCC churches to set aside a percentage of our operating budgets, let's say 1% or 5% or 10%, for a period of time, let's say 5 years or 10 years, to create a corpus of money. And at the end of that time period, the money that has been pooled will be offered as reparations to the historically Black congregations to be used as those congregations discern. Perhaps we will advance this idea through the conference and maybe to the General Synod in the form of a resolution, inviting predominantly white UCC churches across the country to join in this reparations offering. Let me say this. This is a proposal. This is a possibility. There are so many questions to ask about this, and I expect that others will have far wiser thoughts than I might. This may be complicated and messy work, and feelings may get hurt. Mistakes will be made. Grace and trust are needed. But I believe the time is now. Actually, the time is long past, but the time is now because we are in the now for this congregation, for Westmoreland, to consider in some form or fashion offering financial reparations as a response to the injustice, indignity, and inhumanity that Black Americans have known, and that we, and by we, I mean we white Americans who make up the majority of this congregation, have knowingly and perhaps unknowingly supported and contributed to. The call for reparations is grounded in the scriptures of our faith. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote his compelling piece entitled "The Case for Reparations" in the Atlantic in June 2014. He began that piece with words from Deuteronomy, where God says to her beloved people, "Set your enslaved persons free. And when you send out those souls as free persons, you shall not send them out empty-handed. Provide liberally out of your flock," God says, "and provide liberally from your storehouse of grain and from your wine press, thus giving to those free persons some of the bounty with which your God has blessed you." My clergy colleague, Kelly Brown Douglas, an Episcopal priest, wrote in Sojourners just this month that the Christian case for reparations is centered in the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus was crucified and refused to save himself from being crucified, she wrote, to reveal that he emptied himself of all the privilege that might have separated him from the victims of the deadly political, cultural, and institutional and religious realities of his day. To follow Jesus, she wrote, is to name and free ourselves from the institutional ties that bind us to oppression and inequity. And then in the scripture passage that Jim led us in reading today from the book of Acts, the community of Christians, this brand new group of Jesus followers at Antioch, hear that people in Judea, in Jerusalem, are suffering from a famine. And they determined that according to their ability, each would send relief to the believers living in Judea. As Jim said, we're reading through the book of Acts chapter by chapter. Kaylee and I are preaching through that chapter by chapter, week by week, to see how the early church lived in their difficult time in an effort to understand how we might live in our difficult time. And what we can see from this portion of Acts chapter 11 is that the Christians in Antioch saw a need and responded. Racism, prejudice, inequity, white dominance have stained our continent for 400 years. We live in a time of need. And the question is, how will we respond? For 300 years, white people owned Black people as chattel slaves. And after the Civil War, Black persons who had been enslaved in a large portion of this country were promised land on which to build new lives, and white Americans never made good on that promise. For the next 100 years, Black people were overtly denied access to houses, to jobs, to schools, to medical care, to justice. For example, when the Social Security system was created in 1935, bigoted lawmakers excluded domestic workers and farm workers, which meant that 60% of Black Americans were not eligible for Social Security benefits. For the past 50 years, since the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, many white Americans have pretended that the economic playing field is equal and have degraded or punished people of color for not succeeding, or have simply ignored the realities that still plague our land. The median wealth of a Black American family is $17,150. The median wealth of a white American family is $171,000, 10 times higher. That is the result of 400 years of inequality. In 2012, we learned that one of our nationwide banks charged African Americans higher fees and interest rates on mortgages than they charged white borrowers with the same credit scores. That bank charged higher rates to 34,000 customers of color. And at the same time that bank was charging Black customers higher interest rates, that bank also had an outreach program to Black churches to encourage Black churchgoers to do business with that bank. The system is rotten. 42% of Black college students graduate from college, compared to 62% of white college students who graduate from college. Black males are just 6% of the US population, yet account for 35% of the male prison population. The system is rigged. It is wrong. Inequality is real and it is pervasive. Racism is historic, and it is alive right now. As with the Christians in Antioch who saw a famine, the need is clear. How will we respond? What can we do about racism? That's a question that good, well-meaning, liberal white people who live in Bethesda and Washington, D.C. and other places ask. What can we do? Here is an answer. We can offer reparations to Black Americans and or to historically Black institutions. Specifically, predominantly white churches can offer reparations to historically Black churches. And even more specifically, I ask you, I ask us, I ask the people of Westmoreland Congregational United Church of Christ to do that. But times are tough, someone might say. We face significant financial concerns as a church. Yes, that is correct. And we should do it anyway. But Westmoreland never profited from slavery, or I never profited from slavery, someone might say. Right. This is not about you. This is not about our congregation personally. This is about the benefits that those of us who are the white members of this predominantly white church have inherited. J.P. Morgan, Chase, Lehman Brothers, Wachovia, AIG, New York Life, Aetna, Union Pacific, CSX, Canadian National Railway, Brooks Brothers, Brown University, Yale, Georgetown, Emory, Tulane, Baylor, Sewanee, all of those companies and schools have admitted that they profited from racism and from slavery. Reparations offered from institutions to institutions recognize that racism is embedded in our culture. But what about reparations to Native Americans or to Asian Americans or to women? All of those are valid. They're needed. Let's work on those. But let's not be immobilized by whataboutism. But there's so many unknowns, someone might say. What we need is a good plan and a process. Maybe. But reparations is not about control. Reparations is not about controlling the process. Reparations are about offering a portion of yourself to the world without counting the cost, trusting that God will do more with our money and our intentions than we can yet imagine. Reparations won't fix 400 years of racism. A white church offering a small amount of money to Black churches won't solve the problems of the past, someone might say. True. Reparations offered with a sincere apology, and they must be accompanied with a sincere apology. Reparations offered with a sincere apology and offered as a significant symbol in the present speak with vast hope for the future. Aren't we doing enough already? Someone might ask. Our social justice grants and the Service Corps and all of the good things we do, they're good things. Keep doing them. We will, and we can do more. I don't know that reparations is a perfect idea. I don't know that we'll come up with a perfect plan. I don't know that we have the courage to do this well, but we can try. There will always be naysayers and question askers and hand wringers. In 1785, our UCC ancestors ordained the first African-American clergy person because it was the right thing to do. In 1846, our UCC forebears created the first integrated anti-slavery society because it was the right thing to do. In 1853, the Congregational Church ordained the first woman minister because it was the right thing to do. In 1972, the UCC ordained the first openly gay man to be a minister. It was the right thing to do. In the 1960s, Lincoln Congregational Temple and Westmoreland Church created the Lincoln Westmoreland Housing, the nation's first faith-based housing authority, because our city needed it, and it was the right thing to do. In the 1980s, the Westmoreland Service Corps was created because the people of this church saw a need and responded. It was the right thing to do. Racism, injustice, inequity, white privilege. The needs are clear. Will we respond? Acts 11, the words we read, verses 28 and 29. The community of Christians at Antioch hear that people in Judea are suffering from a famine, and they determined that according to their ability, each would send relief to the believers living in Judea. They saw a need, and they responded. So, you know that I grew up a Baptist. And it is the custom, the tradition of Baptist churches to end their times of worship with an invitation. Attendees, church members, churchgoers are invited often to come to the front of the church in full view of the entire congregation to give their life to Jesus or to join the church or to say they want to be baptized. We're not going to do that. That's not the UCC tradition, and that's a little hard to do via Zoom. But I do want to end this sermon, with an invitation. I want to invite you to bring your full hearts, your full minds, your full selves to this question of reparations. I want you to think about what it would feel like for our congregation to engage in this work. I want you to pray about this. I want you to flat out spend a whole lot of time talking to God about what this might mean for you, for our church, for our other congregations, and for the world. And then, in a matter of days or weeks, feel free to email me or Kaylee or one of our governance council members and offer your thoughts and ideas. Enter into a time of discernment. That's the invitation. Consider the needs of the world. That is the invitation. And ask yourself and our congregation, how best may we respond? That is the invitation. Amen.